water aircraft carriers are not ships in the traditional sense. They are mobile pieces of national territory, floating extensions of a country's industrial base, command structure, and military doctrine. When a carrier enters a region, it doesn't just bring aircraft. It brings surveillance, strike power, logistics, command and control, and political leverage. A true blue water carrier is designed to operate independently across oceans, sustain high-intensity air operations for months, and impose air power without relying on foreign bases or overflight permission. That ability remains one of the clearest dividing lines between global military powers and regional ones. No country has invested more deeply in that concept than the United States. For over half a century, the backbone of American naval aviation has been the nuclear supercarrier. The Nimitz class, introduced in the 1970s, set a benchmark that still defines what blue carrier power projection looks like. Each ship displaces over 100,000 tons at full load, stretches more than 330 meters in length, and carries a flight deck wider than many city blocks. But the real difference isn't size, it's endurance. Two A4W pressurized water nuclear reactors generate steam for 4 turbines driving 4 shafts, producing roughly 260,000 shaft horsepower. That power allows sustained speeds over 30 knots without concern for fuel consumption. A Nimitz doesn't refuel like conventional ships. It operates for decades between reactor refuelings, limited primarily by crew fatigue and logistics for aviation fuel, food, and spare parts. In operational terms, that means the carrier doesn't need to go home. The supply chain comes to it. This endurance fundamentally shapes American carrier doctrine. US carriers are designed to stay on station, continuously generating air sorties while escorts rotate in and out. The carrier strike group becomes a semi-permanent airbase at sea, capable of supporting sustained campaigns rather than short deployments. The flight deck reflects this philosophy. Nimitz-class carriers use CATOBAR, catapult-assisted takeoff but arrested recovery. Steam catapults accelerate aircraft from 0 to flying speed in roughly 90 meters, allowing jets to launch at maximum takeoff weight. That single design choice unlocks everything else. Heavy fighters can carry full fuel and weapons loads. Electronic warfare aircraft can launch with large jamming pods. Airborne early warning aircraft, like the E-2 Hawkeye, can operate from the deck, extending radar coverage hundreds of kilometers beyond the ship. Carrier-based tankers can refuel strike packages mid-mission. This is why American carriers don't just strike targets. They create airspace dominance bubbles. They see farther, coordinate better, and stay airborne longer than carriers that rely on ski jumps for vertical launches. Survivability is baked into the design. Nimitz-class carriers are divided into thousands of watertight compartments. Magazines are armored and isolated. Fire suppression systems are redundant and automated. Damage control teams train constantly for worst-case scenarios. The carrier itself is heavily defended by rolling airframe missiles, evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, and Phalanx CIWS. But its true protection comes from the strike group. Aegis destroyers provide long-range missile defense. Submarines screen underwater threats. Aircraft patrol hundreds of kilometers outward, detecting and intercepting threats before they approach. The Gerald R4 class doesn't replace this model, it evolves it. At first glance, the Ford looks similar to a Nimitz. The dimensions are nearly identical. The displacement is similar. But under the skin, it's a fundamentally different machine. The Ford class was designed around electricity, not steam. Its new reactor plant generates nearly 3 times the electrical power of earlier carriers, creating massive surplus capacity for future systems. That power feeds the Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System, or EMALS. Instead of steam pistons, EMALS uses linear induction motors to accelerate aircraft with finely controlled force curves. This reduces stress on airframes, improves reliability over time, and allows a much wider range of aircraft weights, from heavy strike fighters to future unmanned combat aircraft, to launch from the same system. EMALS also eliminates miles of steam piping, freeing internal volume and reducing maintenance complexity. Recovery is handled by advanced arresting gear, which replaces traditional hydraulic systems with energy-absorbing motors. Like EMALS, AAG can be tuned digitally for different aircraft types, reducing wear and enabling smoother recoveries. Together, EMALS and AAG are designed to increase sortie generation rates. More launches, more recoveries, less downtime. The Ford class also reimagines internal layout. Weapons elevators are electromagnetic, moving ordnance faster from magazines to the flight deck. The island is smaller and repositioned, increasing deck space and improving aircraft flow. Sensors and radar systems are consolidated into dual-band arrays designed for both air search and fire control. Most importantly, the Ford is built with a growth margin. Directed energy weapons, advanced electronic warfare systems, and next-generation radars all require electrical power. Ford doesn't just support them, it anticipates them. In many ways, it's less about today's carrier air wing and more about what naval aviation will look like 30 years from now. This approach reflects American doctrine at its core. The US carrier is not meant to operate at the edge of capability. It's meant to dominate the operational environment through excess. Excess power, excess endurance, excess aircraft, and excess integration. Russia's carrier story sits on the opposite end of that spectrum. Admiral Kuznetsov was never intended to mirror American supercarriers. Originally designated a heavy aircraft-carrying cruiser, it reflects Soviet thinking from the late Cold War. The ship displaces roughly 58,000 to 60,000 tons, nearly half the mass of a Nimitz, and relies on conventional steam boilers rather than nuclear propulsion. 8 KVG-4 boilers feed steam turbines generating about 200,000 shaft horsepower, giving the ship respectable speed but limited endurance. Unlike American carriers, Kuznetsov must refuel regularly, restricting how long it can operate far from friendly ports. The flight deck reveals even more constraints. Kuznetsov uses stow-bar, short takeoff but arrested recovery. Aircraft launch via a ski jump ramp at the bow, using engine thrust and lift rather than catapult acceleration. This design is simpler and cheaper, but it comes with severe trade-offs. Fighters must launch with reduced fuel and weapons loads, limiting range and strike capability. Heavy aircraft, like fixed-wing airborne early warning platforms, cannot operate from the deck at all. As a result, Kuznetsov's air wing is fighter-centric. Su-33s and MiG-29s provide air defense and limited strike capability, but the ship lacks the organic sensor reach of a Katobar carrier. Without fixed-wing AEW, situational awareness is narrower and reaction times are longer. Helicopters partially compensate, but they cannot match the altitude, endurance, or coverage of aircraft like the E-2 Hawkeye. The ship's original concept tried to offset these limitations by carrying heavy anti-ship missiles. Kuznetsov was armed with long-range cruise missiles embedded in the hull, blurring the line between carrier and surface combatant. In practice, this made the ship heavier and more complex without solving its aviation limitations. Operational history has been unforgiving. Kuznetsov's deployment off Syria exposed chronic propulsion issues, fires, accidents, and maintenance shortfalls. The ship has spent more time in repair docks than at sea, and reports increasingly suggest it may never return to full operational service. Kuznetsov illustrates the limits of trying to do carrier aviation without fully committing to it. Stobar carriers can support regional operations, but sustained blue water power projection demands catapults, endurance, and logistics depth, all areas where Russia has struggled. China has been watching this contrast closely. Early Chinese carriers, Liaoning and Shandong, were based on Soviet designs and inherited the same Stobar constraints. They provided valuable training platforms and regional presence, but not true blue water reach. The Type 003 Fujian represents a decisive break from that past. Fujian is China's first Catobar carrier. Displacing an estimated 80,000 to 90,000 tons, it is smaller than American supercarriers, but significantly larger and more capable than Kuznetsov-type designs. Most importantly, it uses electromagnetic catapults powered by an integrated electric propulsion system. This allows heavier aircraft to launch at full weight and opens the door to fixed-wing AEW, tankers, and stealth fighters. The air wing is still evolving, but projected to include upgraded J-15 variants, the emerging J-35 stealth fighter, and the KJ-600 airborne early warning aircraft. Fujian doesn't yet match the sortie generation or endurance of US carriers, but it marks China's entry into genuine blue water carrier aviation, particularly in the Western Pacific. The United Kingdom and France take more specialized approaches. Britain's Queen Elizabeth-class carriers are large, around 65,000 tons, but deliberately simpler. They use STOVL operations centered on the F-35B, eliminating the need for catapults and arresting gear. Integrated electric propulsion provides efficiency and flexibility, but the absence of fixed-wing AEW and tanker aircraft limits independent operations. Instead, the QE class is optimized for coalition warfare, operating alongside US carriers and NATO partners. France's Charles de Gaulle operates a unique niche. At just over 42,000 tons, it is far smaller than American carriers, but it retains nuclear propulsion and Catobar capability. 2 K-15 reactors give it essentially unlimited endurance, and its flight deck supports Rafale M fighters and E-2 Hawkeye AEW aircraft. It is the only non-US carrier capable of fixed-wing AEW operations, giving France independent blue water aviation capability despite the smaller hull. Across all these designs, the same question keeps resurfacing. Are carriers still relevant in an age of long-range missiles and hypersonic weapons? The answer lies in how carriers are evolving. Modern carriers are not meant to sail unprotected into missile envelopes. They operate as nodes in layered, networked systems. Escorts provide missile defense. Submarines hunt threats before launch. Aircraft extend detection and engagement ranges. Future carriers are being designed around electrical power, sensors, and integration, not just aircraft. The real competition isn't about how many carriers a country has. It's about how much power they can generate, how flexible their launch systems are, and what kind of air wing they can sustain thousands of miles from home. In that competition, the United States remains unmatched. Russia's experience shows the cost of compromise. China is accelerating rapidly, and Europe maintains niche but capable platforms. In the end, blue water carriers are not about nostalgia. They are about control of airspace, of sea lanes, and of tempo. They are the ultimate expression of a nation's ability to project power, adapt to new threats, and keep fighting far from home. That's why carriers still matter, and why the design choices behind them tell you exactly how a country expects to fight its wars, long before the first aircraft ever leaves the deck. And that brings us to the end of our look into the ships that quietly define who controls the world's oceans, the floating airbases that turn steel, reactors, and electronics into global reach. From America's nuclear-powered supercarriers built for sustained dominance, to Russia's constrained ski jump experiment, and the new challenges emerging in China and Europe, this is the real hierarchy of blue water power. Not in hull count, but in endurance, air wing depth, and systems integration. Now it's your turn. Which carrier philosophy do you think matters most in the decades ahead? The US model of nuclear endurance and maximum air power, or more compact, cost-controlled designs optimized for regional control? And if you've ever seen a carrier up close, on deck, or from the air, share what stood out to you in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the machines that command the seas, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. Thanks for watching. Stay sharp, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next one.